Hi, everybody. Welcome to session 5. In this one, we're talking about Anglicanism. And the title is Who, What, Where, When, Why, How. Now, our first question is a combo. Who are we, and what is Anglicanism? Now, Anglicans are Christians from the Church of England. Anglicanism is essentially the way of being an Anglican. So why are we called Episcopalian rather than Anglican? Well, the short answer is that we are Anglicans. But for those 17th century revolutionaries, a name so attached to England wasn't going to fly. We'll get to that in a minute. Question 2 covers all those questions in the middle, right? Where do we come from? When did we happen? And why? So, if you've watched any salacious movie about the Tudors in England during the 16th century, then you have plenty of material for the scandalous side of our church history. King Henry, wives, heirs, power, money, control, right? And unfortunately, pretty much all of this stuff is true. Though, let us not allow our brothers and sisters in faith to pretend that their stories aren't also rich with intrigue. I generally think that they're kind of jealous that people don't want to make movies about their founders. But the titillating nature of this version of events tends to eclipse the more fascinating part of the story. While the rest of the continent was on fire, literally, right, with theological revolutionaries who not only protested the church, but burned them, like broke stained glass windows and destroyed those elements they considered too papish. England sought to sidestep the problem of Protestantism and the incredible influence of Roman Catholicism in England by seizing back control of the church from Rome. And unlike other countries like Sweden and Germany and other newly formed nation states, which were establishing a new Protestant church as their state church, England established a state church that would be neither explicitly Protestant nor Catholic, so that all English people could find a home within it. It was then up to Thomas Cranmer, the renowned Archbishop of Canterbury and ostensible head of the new church below the king, to make Anglicanism into a thing. Otherwise, it's just this empty shell. And what that thing is took another century to really take shape. But this forming moment and this mandate to be a church for all people became the foundation of what Anglicanism would become and remains to be today. A church of tradition and innovation, built upon our Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, and Celtic roots, to be a church for all people, professing many different beliefs around a common practice and life. Why we are here is a whole other complex question. But I think the through line is pretty easy to follow if we think about it. Now, most of the first American settlers came from England, which means they brought the state religion with them. But when they no longer saw themselves as English, but American, The Church of England stopped making sense to them in a very practical way, right? And specifically, when they went to war with England, and their priests all had sworn an oath to protect the King of England. What you gonna do? So those new Americans went about trying to found their own church, right? Think of it as you have the Church of England, the Church of the United States of America. In much the same way that the Scottish, Irish, and Welsh had already done. But of course, the English were not super receptive to this idea in the 1780s, but the Scottish were. Right? Of course they were. So they agreed to ordain our bishops in order to establish our church, but under 3 conditions. One, that we use their name, the Episcopal Church. So they're known as the Episcopal Church of Scotland, or the Scottish Episcopal Church. So we took that name. We also were asked to, second, use their prayer book. So our BCP, our prayer book, is not based on the English book of 1662, but on the Scottish prayer book, which is a little different. And the third thing, and this one is the one that I think is the most exciting and the most interesting, but for our purposes, we can worry about it another time. And it's that we include the epiclesis in all of our Eucharistic prayers. Now, the epiclesis is the invoking of the Holy Spirit to come into the blessing of the elements. It's not something that is required in Catholic Eucharistic prayers. And so in many Anglican Eucharistic prayers, it's not present, but it's present in all of ours because we said we would. Now, what our rebelliousness and the end of the era of colonialism brings is a new vision for Anglicanism that is about state churches that are not under the throne of England, but are in communion with England, meaning that we connect with one another as equals, like we do at the table for communion. So today, the Episcopal Church is one church within the worldwide Anglican communion. Question 3. How are we Anglican? Now, all that history explains where we come from, but it only hints at how we are Anglican in anything but the most legal sense. Anglicanism is that common table. It is the belief and practice that makes a common table between warring factions possible within the church. Now, this doesn't mean that we've been terribly good at this work, or that we haven't had any fights or even schisms. Far from it. What it does mean is that we believe that our holding that tension is more important than getting a theological concept right. Just reading the Book of Common Prayer, you can see a kind of both-and approach to our liturgy, which allows Catholics and Protestants to both worship side by side while thinking that this is their church. It also doesn't mean that everything goes, or that there aren't limits to what is included in our via media, right? The middle way. It means decent, coherent differences have room to live side by side. It does not mean that intolerant and abusive theology must be tolerated. So, for instance, white supremacy has no room within Anglicanism today, even as it once was tolerated and often championed. White supremacy, by its very nature, belittles and destroys the dignity of human beings that we are charged with respecting and loving as equals. So to preserve that tension, we have to draw the line where that tension is eclipsed by abuse or coercion. Because we need to keep that from destroying what we have. So the challenge given to us in Anglicanism is expressing something unique within the wider church. That our central theology is to put our practice before our theology. That we first gather in worship and then become formed by that community. That belief isn't first something to be memorized and agreed to, but something discovered and developed by participating in community. In other words, we put our emphasis squarely in our liturgy rather than our teaching about the Bible or our catechism or a common confession of belief. For many of us, this is a really, really hard thing to articulate, but it is something we often take for granted in practice. So your homework this week is to try to describe the Episcopal Church in 30 seconds or less. Right? Think 2 to 3 sentences. And to make things a little bit harder, you cannot mention Henry VIII, Robin Williams, or jokes about our being diet Catholics. Now take a few minutes this week to write from your heart and see what you come up with. Now, you are more than welcome to rewind the video because I snuck some language in the middle that you're welcome to steal. Then bring your responses to our Zoom meeting next week or email them to me. I look forward to hearing what you've come up with. Grace and peace, my friends.